Hallucinations are bad enough, but after a while you learn to cope with things like seeing your dead grandmother crawling up your leg with a knife in her teeth. Most acid fanciers can handle this sort of thing, but nobody can handle that other trip. The possibility that any freak with $1.98 can walk into Circus Circus and suddenly appear in the sky over downtown Las Vegas 12 times the size of God, howling anything that comes into his mind. No, this is not a good town for psychedelic drugs. Reality itself is too twisted. Hello everyone, my name is Kieran O'Day, and that was one of my favourite passages from one of Hunter S. Thompson's most famous books, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Today I want to speak to you about Thompson's take on the unreliable narrator, and how this unique spin has shaped my own writing. Thompson was, and still is, considered an oddity at worst, and a revolutionary at best. Personally, I believe the truth sways back and forth between the two. He was a deeply interesting and contradictory man, who detested the fact that in his eyes, most authors missed the truth in their piece, and in turn, society as a whole. And yet he would greatly exaggerate his own stories for the sake of entertainment. Thompson is widely regarded as being the father of gonzo journalism, which is journalism that is completely void of any objectivity. He abandoned objectivity after reading the likes of Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, simply deciding it wasn't the way he liked to write. Instead, Thompson would force himself into his stories and use his life experiences to form and shape his writing, creating a distinct grey area between truth and lie. Unlike Hemingway and most other authors who use life experiences as a stimulus, though, Thompson took things a step further. He'd put himself in unique, terrifying, and often dangerous or at best unpleasant situations that would give him fascinating things to write about. To name just a few, he joined the Hells Angels, ran for sheriff in a small town, and did copious amounts of drugs in Las Vegas. This brings me to the reason I'm here. To analyse Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and to discuss his use of the unreliable narrator in it. But before I do though, I first need to address the unreliable narrator as a concept. It's a broad one that can take on many forms, but the way I look at it, almost all types of this literary technique can, for the most part, be split into one of two categories. The first is what I like to call the deceptive unreliable narrator. These are the narrators who are deliberately misinforming the reader, or simply leaving them in the dark to skew the events of the story for their own benefit. Famous examples of these include Kaiser Soze in The Usual Suspects and Brian E. Tallis in Atonement. The other is what I refer to as the innocent or passive unreliable narrator. These are narrators who aren't lying as such, but their view on the world is skewed due to age, mental capacity, upbringing, etc. Examples of this variety include Christopher Boone, the child narrator of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night, and Edward Bloom in Big Fish. Thompson as the narrator doesn't fit neatly into either of these categories though, and I'll show you why as we look at an excerpt from Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Some might argue he could be categorized as an innocent or passive unreliable narrator due to his drug-induced state of mind, but as we get into it, I will point out how he differs from this category. You will also see the pattern that Thompson follows, sentence by sentence, which demonstrates his method. Now, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas is over 200 pages long, and unfortunately we don't have time to go over every page with a fine-tooth comb. However, the pattern I mentioned earlier is visible from the first page to the last, so I think we should look at the opening chapter and discuss what can be seen there. For those who don't know, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas is a novel written in the style of an autobiographical recount. However, it does draw on real-life events and the people connected to, and including, Hunter S. Thompson. In it, Thompson assumes the role of a fictionalized and exaggerated caricature of himself named Raoul Duke, who was accompanied by his attorney, Dr. Gonzo, who in turn is based on Thompson's real-life friend, Oscar Zeta Acosta. The duo travel to Las Vegas, fueled by various drugs, chasing the American dream, and lamenting the failure of the 1960s counterculture movement. In this opening passage, they are still on their way to Las Vegas, and eventually stop to pick up a hitchhiker. Dr. Gonzo appears to be in control of his mental state, but Duke is desperately trying to hide his paranoia and hallucinations. This is the very first paragraph of the novel. I'll read it first and then we'll go back to analyze it. We were somewhere around Barstow, around the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold. I remember saying something like, "I feel a bit lightheaded, maybe you should drive." And suddenly there was a terrible roar all around us. The sky was full of what looked like huge bats, all swooping and screeching and diving around the car. And a voice was screaming, "Holy Jesus, what are these goddamn animals?" I've separated the paragraph in bold to show the points where Thompson demonstrates his method. He'll begin a passage with ordinary descriptions of real-world, believable events, and then finish the passage with some extraordinary descriptions of outlandish events. The next paragraph follows the same pattern. Then it was quiet again. My attorney had taken his shirt off and was pouring beer on his chest to facilitate the tanning process. "What the hell are you yelling about?" he muttered. "Never mind," I said. "It's your turn to drive." I hit the brakes and aimed the great red shark towards the shoulder of the highway. No point mentioning those bats, I thought. The poor bastard will see them soon enough. It's clear that Thompson is not portraying a deceptive, unreliable narrator, because the reader is shown very early on that Duke is unreliable and high on drugs, which are named in the next paragraph as being everything from amyl to cocaine to LSD. He isn't deceiving the reader because he's letting them in on the joke from the get-go. Likewise, he isn't even an innocent or passive unreliable narrator, despite his state. And that will become clear in the next few passages when a hitchhiker is picked up and Duke tries to contain himself. This same lonely desert was the last known home of the Manson family. Will he make that grim connection when my attorney starts screaming about bats and huge manta rays coming down on the car? If so, well, we'll just have to cut his head off and bury him somewhere. Because it goes without saying that we can't turn him loose. Jesus, did I say that or just think it? Was I talking? Did they hear me? There was no sound from the back seat. Maybe I'd better have a chat with this boy, I thought. Perhaps if I explain things, he'll rest easy. I leaned around in the seat and gave him a fine, big smile, admiring the shape of his skull. The reader's awareness that Duke is an unreliable narrator has been established. Thompson is using these hallucinations to both make the story more interesting, while also giving the reader a wink and a nudge, so to speak, to ensure that a healthy level of distrust is maintained. Duke then goes on to tell the boy about why they are going to Las Vegas. This is a very ominous assignment, with overtones of extreme personal danger. "Hell, I forgot all about this beer. You want one?" He shook his head. "How about some ether?" I said. "What? Never mind. Let's get right on to the heart of this thing. You see, about 24 hours ago, we were sitting in the polo lounge of the Beverly Hills Hotel, and we were just sitting there under this palm tree when this uniformed dwarf came up to me with a pink telephone and said, 'This must be the call you've been waiting for all this time, sir.' I laughed and ripped open a beer can that foamed all over the back seat while I kept talking. And you know, he was right. I had been expecting that call. But I didn't know who it would come from. Do you follow me?" The boy's face was a mask of pure fear and bewilderment. Thompson himself has now even acknowledged the fact that Duke is an unreliable narrator, by showing the boy's reaction to his story. This self-awareness separates him from innocent and passive narrators such as Christopher Boone in The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night. Thompson's use of this unique brand of unreliable narrator forces the reader to use their own judgment to sort the fact from the fiction. This is what he sought to do with his journalism: tackle the problems he saw in society with humour and empower his readers to make up their own minds. This puts a certain level of responsibility onto their shoulder and makes them consider the viewpoints of others in order to reach a reasonable conclusion that may be different from the one they had at the start. It is this aspect of his writing that really spoke to me and is something that I've strove towards in my comparatively brief time writing. This is a piece I've written with this in mind. It too is an excerpt from a piece of fiction written in autobiographical style, and like Thompson, I've used real-life experiences and relationships to inform the story. That was the easy part. The hard part was trying to replicate Thompson's unreliable narrator in a way where I wasn't outright lying, but there could be no doubt that the narrator's version of events needed to be carefully scrutinized by the reader. Like I did before, I've shown the pattern in bold, and I believe this is a solid example of an unreliable narrator that is not deceitful, but is also self-aware. When I opened my eyes and peered through the dimly lit room, the vague shapes around me reached out and pulled back, keeping time with my rapid breathing like a metronome. I knew I must have still been in my bedroom, but nothing was the same. The windows were on the wrong side, my bed was facing the wrong way, and the door wasn't where I left it. I went through it anyway and began to walk down the hall. It was more of a standing crawl than a walk though, as I pressed myself up against the walls. I must have looked like I'd lost my mind, but it felt right at the time, and besides, I had. The hall was longer and wider than I remembered. Suddenly, there was a door handle sticking into my side. I didn't know where the door led, but I knew I didn't want to be in the hall anymore, so I started trying to push it open, but it wouldn't cooperate. This is bullshit, I thought. It's my apartment, why can't I go in there? This was the worst it had ever been. I'd done acid more times than I could remember, and there'd always been the odd trip where I'd spend a few hours pacing back and forth, talking myself down from the cliff edge of insanity before a song I liked would come on the stereo and pull me back. I couldn't even remember when I dropped this time though. How long had it been? Was this it? Had I finally gone too far? It's cool, just chill, I said. Just let this moment pass. But it was too late. Once the snowball had started rolling, there was no stopping it. Just go back to your room, put some Pink Floyd on, and before you know it, you'll be sweet again. The thought of music gave me the resolve to get back on my feet, cling to the wall, and pull myself back towards my bedroom. But as I crept closer, I could hear voices coming from within. There was no one in there when I left, but now there was at least one person in there. It wasn't me though, I know because I checked. Sure enough, I was still in the hall. It was a man's voice, and it sounded like he was chanting something. It kept getting louder, and then softer, and then there'd be no voice at all. And then it would come back even louder again. Nope, 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 I whispered as I crawled backwards this time towards the door handle in the hallway. Gotta go, gotta get away. I felt it stick in my back, and I pushed to turn it open again. I clawed and I banged, but it wouldn't listen to my pleas. I yanked on the handle in one final act of desperation, and it swung open. I wasted no time in darting inside and closing the door behind me. There was no light, only darkness. But worst of all, the door led nowhere. I was trapped, and couldn't even turn around to get out. I thrashed and struggled to free myself from the tiny prison cell, and things started falling on my head. I was under attack. The thrashing got more violent before the door flung open, and I fell backwards into the hall. I pulled the linen and the towels from over my head and looked up at my brother. He was staring at me with utter contempt and bewilderment. Whether successful or not as a work of short fiction, I have followed Thompson's pattern and attempted to utilize a similar brand of humor to punctuate the moments that remind the reader to think for themselves and question the narrator's version of the events. I'll leave you with this thought. Even if you aren't interested in emulating Thompson's use of the unreliable narrator, all writers should learn from his approach to writing. If you are lacking inspiration or feel your life isn't interesting to write about, take some risks. This doesn't mean you have to take drugs or do anything dangerous, but putting yourself out there and exposing yourself to new experiences will only be of benefit to your writing. And when you do, perhaps you'll play with Thompson's take on the unreliable narrator, as a means of turning a fairly interesting experience into an extraordinary one, without having to flat out lie to the readers. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.